My name is Sophie Loidolt. I have the honor and pleasure to be the president of the German Society of Phänomenology, die Deutsche Gesellschaft für Phänomenologische Forschung. And in this function, I am very happy to be here today at the Freie Universität Berlin to welcome you at today's Husserl Lecture. Let me shortly explain what the Husserl Lecture is, who hosts it, and most importantly, who is our honored lecturer today. The Husserl Lecture is an award which the German Society for Phenomenology biannually gives to an outstanding researcher in our field. In fact, this award rather means a lot of work for the one who is honored, because the honor consists in being invited to give a lecture in one's field of research. This tradition exists for 10 years now. The first Husserl Lecture was given by Thomas Fuchs in 2014, and you can look up the other award winners on our homepage. And don't be confused here. We had a little bit of different years going on in the last time because of Corona, of course. So in reality, it would be every 2 years. Oh, no, in theory, it would be every 2 years. But in reality, we had Husserl Lectures in the last 3 years consecutively. So it's not that we suddenly have an annual prize. It's still a biannual prize, but we were trying to make up for the Corona times. So the lecture itself is named after the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, but it does not necessarily have to engage with Husserl's work. In our society, we have a broad notion of phenomenology and welcome, as we will surely also see today, not only exegetic and traditional work, but phenomenological takes on burning topics such as political emotions. I guess it couldn't be more burning at the moment here. So with great pleasure, I announce that the advisory board of the Phenomenological Society has decided that the winner of this year's Husserl Lecture is Professor Sara Heinämaa from Finland. I am personally very happy about this choice. You will hear shortly about Sara Heinämaa's important contributions to phenomenological research from Professor Sonja Rinofner-Kreidl from Graz, who happens to be the last award winner of the Husserl Lecture. We do not always have this double honor that the last laureate gives the laudation or the laudatory speech for the present one, so I'm very happy to be able to welcome Sonja here as well today. Here's another hand for you. Last but not least, why are we here in Berlin? Apart from the fact that it is always fantastic to be in Berlin, there is a special reason. The Husserl Lecture always takes place at changing locations, which are relevant locations for phenomenological research. The idea is thus not only to put a person in the spotlight who is giving the lecture, but also a place. And certainly places are these places because of persons who have contributed in important and sustainable ways to our research community, who work with students and who build up something. Let me extend a great thanks to Professor Hilge Landweer, who has done this important work for 3 decades here at the Freie Universität Berlin and has founded a whole tradition of phenomenology here. She and Slaby, to whom my thanks go out as well, here you are, have agreed to be the hosts of today's event. And I'm very, very thankful for this. It's great to be here. And thanks so much for having us. And I hope that Berlin, with this event, will also stay a place where phenomenology thrives. As everybody knows, events don't just organize themselves. Let me give a hand and extend my thanks to Janis. Where is he? Over there. Thanks very much for all the organization you did, to Henrietta Schiffer and to Gerhard Thonhauser, who have taken care of so many things in the background and the foreground, and things that happen in addition to this lecture. So just a few infos here now. Right after the Laudatio, lowered by Hilge, the Laudatio by Sonja, and the talk by Sara. There will be a discussion. Then I hand over the actual award. This is a little surprise for the students. There is an object. And then there will be a reception. But it does not end here. Tomorrow, there's going to be a workshop where we discuss Sara Heinämaa's work together with her between 10 to 13 hours, to which you are all cordially invited. Malin Meyer and Vanessa Ostino, where are they? Hello. Will give presentations at this workshop. And the topic will be political phenomenology, embodiment, agency, and encroachment, with a focus on the philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir. And at this point, I also say hello to Manu Garcia, because she represents Beauvoir here as well. So, dear colleagues, friends, dear students, dear Sara, dear Sonja, dear Hilge, without further ado, let me give the word to you, and I look forward to a stimulating lecture and discussions.
Berlin is not the first place that comes to mind when we speak of phenomenology. There are places such as Freiburg, Munich, or Göttingen, or Marburg, that seem to have contributed much more to phenomenology, at least from a historical perspective. We feel all the more honored that the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Phänomenologische Forschung has decided to hold this year's Husserl Lecture here at the Institute of Philosophy of the Freie Universität Berlin. On behalf of this institute, I welcome all of you, especially Professor Sophie Loidolt, President of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Phänomenologische Forschung, Professor Rinofner-Kreidl, who will offer an appreciation of the work of Sara Heinämaa, and of course, Professor Heinämaa herself, our special guest of honor today. Despite my skeptical remark about Berlin and phenomenology at the beginning, I would like to say a few words about how the history of phenomenology is connected with Berlin and especially with the Freie Universität. Husserl studied in Berlin from 1878 to 1881, namely mathematics with Karl Weierstrass, among others, and philosophy with Friedrich Pausen. He returned to Berlin in 1883 for a short time as Weierstrass' assistant, and until Weierstrass fell ill. He returned to Berlin, later in his career as a phenomenological researcher in Freiburg. In 1923, Husserl turned down an offer of a professorship in Berlin, as Heidegger later did twice. But there are other people who had much closer connections to Berlin and who strongly influenced phenomenology. I am not thinking of Elisabeth Blochmann, who was a friend of Martin Heidegger and who supported education in social pedagogics and the training of social workers at the Pestalozzi-Fröbel-Haus in Berlin in the Roaring Twenties, long before she became the first woman to hold a chair in Marburg. I am thinking of Karl Stumpf, philosopher, psychologist, and one of the founders of musicology, to whom Husserl's logical investigations are dedicated. Stumpf had studied with Rudolf Lotze and with Franz Brentano, who, of course, deeply influenced Husserl's concept of intentionality. In 1894, Karl Stumpf became a professor in Berlin, and together with the students Wertheimer, Kofka, and Köhler, he went on to found the Berlin School of Gestalt Psychology. The city of Berlin has an honorary grave for Karl Stumpf in nearby Lichterfelde. I didn't know it before. As most of you know, Gestalt psychology was an important resource for phenomenology, not only in its early years. But what about the more recent history of phenomenology in Berlin? When I was appointed assistant professor at the Freie Universität in 1991, no one taught phenomenology here. The Freie Universität was founded in 1948. From 1980 to 1992, Ernst Tugendhat, who died last year, was professor at this institute. Tugendhat's mother had inspired her son to read Being and Time at the age of 15 years, and his aunt, Helene Weiss, had studied with Heidegger and could give her lecture notes to her nephew. In this way, Tugendhat's family background awakened his interest in Heidegger's version of phenomenology, and later Tugendhat habilitated, it was in 1965, with his well-known work, The Concept of Truth in Husserl and Heidegger. But later, especially during this time at the Freie Universität, Tugendhat developed his interests in moral philosophy and became an analytic philosopher. A few other colleagues were interested in particular aspects of phenomenology or its antecedents, like Theunissen and Kierkegaard, but none of them offered courses in phenomenology specifically. So in the 90s, when I first came here, phenomenology was hardly on the scene. But then the philosophical times were a-changing. A few years later, we had regular courses in phenomenology, 2 habilitations explicitly devoted to phenomenology, and a large number of phenomenological dissertations. One was on the emotions in early phenomenology by Ingrid Vendrell-Ferran, I think it was in 2008. Another on hunger and eating disorders by Isabella Maczynski. The further study was devoted to the felt body and concentration, an investigation on performance in music by Julian Lee, and the study of trauma and the felt body by Ilona Slesak, who is there today, to name just a few. One reason for this flourishing of phenomenology was that our Institute of Philosophy developed a corporate identity that included heterogeneous methods and branches, and this implied tolerance for all of them. What was important for the continuity of phenomenological research at our institute was the fact that Jan Slaby was appointed junior professor at the Cluster of Excellent Languages of Emotion in 2010. Since then, the phenomenological sky has expanded at the Freie Universität, and this expansion is one of the reasons why we are here today. Once again, I welcome you all on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy, and I look forward to Sonja Rinofner-Kreidl's appreciation of Sara Heinämaa's work. That's the floor.
Welcome to all of you. I'm happy to be invited to be part of this great event. Hello, Sara. It's a real honor, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about your work only very selectively, of course, but very appreciated. So. As the world presents itself today, amid the much invoked multiple crises, we are challenged to rethink the societal and cultural role of our universities. In particular, the task of academic philosophers does not exhaust itself in producing highly specialized theoretical research and to thereby expand and modify the history of philosophical ideas. Rather, philosophers also address problems that occur in their immediate life-worthy vicinity. Doing so, they may feel prompted to act as a Socratic gadfly, forcing people out of their taken-for-granted ways of judging and living. Yet the same holds for academic traditions. If philosophers commit themselves to think critically, this also applies to their own thinking and thinking traditions. any authentically and radically critical thinking is also self-critical. This idea of a radically critical thinking is germane to the phenomenological tradition, which goes back to the work of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Scheler, Arendt, Reinach, and many others. Today, we have gathered to celebrate the outstanding achievements of a member of the international community of phenomenologists whose work brings to bear a succinctly critical and self-critical style of thinking, and in this spirit has had a huge impact on current phenomenological research. It is my honor and my pleasure to welcome and introduce this year's Husserl Award winner, Sara, who is a highly recognized Husserl scholar and phenomenological philosopher. Sara is professor of philosophy at the Department of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. Before she was appointed as full professor at the University of Jyväskylä in 2013, Sara Heinämaa was professor of theoretical philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Uppsala from 2009 to 10, where she also held a 3-month guest professorship of theoretical philosophy in 2001. Before then, in 1998, she was professor of humanist gender studies at the Department of Art at the University of Turku, and in the same year, professor of humanist gender studies at the University of Oslo. Recently, she has acted as recurrent visiting professor of the ERC research project Who Are We? Self-Identity, Social Cognition, and Collective Intentionality, established at the Center for Subjectivity Research and directed by Dan Zahavi, University of Copenhagen. Among Sara Heinämaa's recent major achievements is that she was granted the Gadamer Chair at Boston College 2023 to 25, which was postponed to 25 due to the COVID pandemic. Professor Heinämaa's main areas of research are in phenomenology, existentialism, philosophy of mind, history of philosophy, with a special focus on Descartes, and philosophical methodology. She has done exegetic and humanoidical work on leading figures of the phenomenological movement, among others on Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, Stein, Beauvoir, Levinas, and Irigaray. Systematically, her philosophical work revolves around embodiment, intersubjectivity, temporality, different notions and conceptions of normality and normativity, emotions, and sexual difference, which is quite a lot. Considering the impressive amount of philosophical and institutional work Sara Heinämaa has done, it is impossible to enumerate all her important contributions. I therefore confine myself to selectively mentioning what seems to be representative for the core areas of her academic activities and achievements. From 2017 to 21, Sara was Academy Professor at the Academy of Finland and Research Director of the project Marginalization in Experience, Phenomenological Analysis of Normality and Abnormality, funded by the Academy of Finland and by the University of Jyväskylä. Other funded research projects elaborated on topics like subjectivity, historicity, community or communality, human mortality, gender, power and violence, sexuality, death and the feminine, body and sex in the phenomenological traditions, and others. As far as publications are concerned, I would like to name at least one monograph, which is a famous one and an early one, namely Toward a Phenomenology of Sexual Difference from 2003, and some co-edited volumes. And I spare here the names of the co-editors because today we are talking about Sara. Here are the titles of these volumes: Contemporary Phenomenologies of Normativity, Norms, Goals, and Values, which is a recent one published at Routledge 2022. And another volume at Routledge 2022, Phenomenology as Critic, Why Method Matters. And now some earlier co-edited volumes entitled Phenomenology and the Transcendental. Another one on New Perspectives on Aristotelianism and its Critic from 2015. And one entitled Birth, Death, and Femininity from 2010. And the last one, Consciousness from Perception to Reflection from 2008. So it's clear Sara is a highly productive scholar. Among the many thought-provoking peer-reviewed articles and book chapters Sara published, I only mentioned some recent publications that pinpoint some of her main topics and concerns. For example, from 2022, on the transcendental and eidetic resources of phenomenology, the case of embodiment. Another article from 2021 entitled Cartesian Meditations, Husserl's Pluralistic Egology. And an important topic published in a volume 2021, an article entitled Objectification, Interiorization, and Projection in Phenomenological Research on Dehumanization. There are many others, so forgive me, Sara, but I do this really harsh selection. Over the years, Sara Heinämaa has done a huge amount of work in terms of institutional obligations and service to the community. She has taken responsibility for administrative and supervision tasks, as well as for editorial and advisory tasks. She acted in support of philosophical societies. For instance, as co-founder and two-term president of the Nordic Society for Phenomenology. She also organized and co-organized a great number of conferences and workshops. The readiness to engage wherever it seems beneficial to do so, and the varying range and intensity of her activities shed light on the kind of person Sara Heinämaa is. On many occasions, I witnessed her acting in an attentive, responsive, and most supportive manner. She is a colleague everyone is happy to collaborate with. By my lights, Sara has become a role model for many young researchers, and likewise for those who are less young. In a philosopher's life, role models are not only career models, they radiate beyond the professional sphere. Sara Heinämaa has done and will certainly continue doing an amazing work in pushing forward phenomenological research. Yet, by the same token, she has also been efficient in shaping research communities, small and large, local and global, and of shaping herself as a unique and creative philosopher. Recently, I got stuck on two sentences which are part of Nancy Sherman's wonderful book on Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. These sentences read as follows:
The good brings forth the good without making a fuss. We are doing good deeds because we are members of a community. This is exactly what virtuous people do. Virtuous people are not only members of a community, but constantly act in the light of this awareness. Again, being aware, keeping in mind who they are as members of the community, does not require extra effort. Rather, it remains hidden, or more accurately put, it becomes obvious as an embodied pattern of behavior that is incessantly enacted without attracting attention. This fits with one of the main topics of Sara Heinämaa's work, bodies and bodily achievements, bodily expressions, and vulnerabilities. In the present context, it becomes clear that as soon as we talk about embodied practices, we also talk about social interactions. Suitably, we find the above quoted sentences in a chapter of Schulman's book, which is entitled Intertwining with Each Other. Taking care for mutual intertwinements by encouraging others, by supporting their works, and letting them take part in your own work is among Sara's bright achievements and human skills. I therefore cannot resist assuming that it is more than mere intellectual curiosity that lies beneath Sara Heinämaa's concern for those aspects of Husserl's work that recently have been brought under the label the existential Husserl. What comes to light here is not only a highly interesting field of overlapping philosophical concerns shared by phenomenology and existentialism. What is at stake here more specifically is the idea of philosophy as a vocational life. And this is a topic that concerned Husserl intensively, at least from 1917 onward and until the very end of his life. Delving into the emotional life of human beings from the point of view of Husserl's scholarship especially touches upon the notion of a person and the role of love within a philosophical framework that brings to bear a teleological understanding of human reason. Here are some of Sara Heinämaa's relating original and fruitful papers in which she analyzes the philosophical issues and methodical implications entailed in this entire field of research. There's an article entitled Vocational Life, Personal, Communal, and Temporal Structures, published in Continental Philosophy Review in 2023. Another article published in the Phänomenologische Forschung in 2019, which is entitled Epoche is Personal Transformation and the Similarities Between the Philosophical Change of Attitude and Religious Conversions. And other works, for example, an article published in Phenomenology and Mind in 2018, which is entitled Two Ways of Understanding Persons, a Husserlian Distinction, or a work about personal love, feeling from the death, which was published in a volume edited by Tony Steinbeck, Phenomenology and Perspectives on the Heart. To conclude, let me briefly resume the thought I started with. Our universities are an integral and a crucial part of a civil society and an ongoing cultural project. Recently, it dawned on us that all of this is far less secure and clear than one might wish it would. There is an existential and a political dimension, broadly conceived, entailed in our philosophical work and our self-understanding as philosophers. As has become conspicuous over the last decades, part of our task is to reconsider the pluralistic understanding of what it means to talk about our task as philosophers and our cherished tradition of doing philosophy. Whose task and whose tradition? Who are the beneficiaries of promoting certain ideas and denying others? Which concerns and phenomena are pushed into the background? By highlighting others, how to get a grip on this dialectic of gains and losses, of insights and blindnesses that seems to pervade all our intellectual efforts. These questions are haunting on us. They are disquieting, and they largely complicate the picture. Universities are the natural habitat to elaborate on these questions. Universities, however, are as good as the people who build them and make them places for rethinking the world and its people. The more complicated the picture presents itself, the more challenging the world becomes, the more we stand in need of good people, and good people doing philosophy who are ready to face disquieting questions. Doing so undoubtedly calls for intellectual abilities and training, yet it also calls for courage, resoluteness, and truthfulness. Let me close with a personal note. I'm very happy and grateful for all the vibrant and inspiring discussions I had with Sara, Heinämaa. As many others, I learned a lot from her way of doing phenomenology. What is even more, she's among the best people I ever met, intellectually, effectively, and virtue-wise. So, dear Sara, my warmest congratulations. Thank you.
I'm highly honored, of course, but also moved by a mixture of positive emotions from joy and gratefulness. And it's deeply moving, not only because of my own work, but also the work that's done in the Nordic countries in phenomenology, which is rather new in these countries because it kind of started in old times, but it got a great break after the Second World War. Our doctoral theses were written in German, mainly philosophy before the Second World War. After the war, in English, and it became really dominated by analytical philosophy. Only in 2000, the Nordic scholars managed to establish connections between themselves, and phenomenology started to kind of flourish in these countries. And we were able to kind of support one another, even if we were apart and are still very much apart geographically. So I'm highly happy for this award, not only because of myself, but also because all of the people who in my country and in the Nordic countries are really working hard in phenomenology in the broad sense that we heard. So not just Husserl scholarship, but systematic studies in phenomenology with the help of different phenomenological methods and concepts. So I'm deeply touched and moved, and it's even hard to speak. But I will speak, and I will speak about not actually the title that I gave, which was Political Emotions, Hatred, Disgust, Curiosity and Desire. I skipped curiosity and desire, and I focus on hatred and disgust. And the talk will be about, I think a better title might be Being Disgusted by Hate Speech. And I tried to do this, it's new to me. It's very philosophical, it's not touching empirical investigations about this topic, so it tries to kind of keep a philosophical attitude, but of course I'm very happy to hear any questions, any reactions that are informed by empirical studies on hate speech. So because this is a work in progress and I want to develop it. So I will read it and I hope to keep it in time so that we can have a 20-minute, 30-minute discussion. But still, once again, thank you so much, and thank you the society, thank you the board, and thank you anybody who is interested in my work and has come to hear the talk. So, being disgusted by hate speech. According to common sense, or we could say folk psychology, and this is a great abstraction, but let's do this. Hate speech is an expression of hatred, either pure hatred or hatred in combination with other aversions, such as anger, contempt, resentment, and fear. Thus understood, hate speech is a form of speech behavior that targets the emotion of hatred on other people, either on some social politically marked group of others or on individuals who are taken to represent such marked groups. The most familiar social political markers that today frame hate speech include ethnicity, religion, race, sexual identity, gender, and sex. And of course, you know all this. In this common sense or folk psychological understanding, hate speech would operate mainly by expressing emotive states of their performers. More precisely, the mental states of being antipathically orientated at other people. The offensive words typically used in such speech behavior and discourse would simply manifest the negative emotions of their users and function as instruments of violating the targeted named groups of people and the individuals taking to be representing those groups. This expressive paradigm of common sense conflates with two other ideas. Hate speech is taking to be motivated, so the motivational ground is taking to be in hateful feelings. At the same time, it is claimed to incite similar emotions in its audiences or anyone exposed to it, not even the audience, but anyone exposed, anyone contaminated by it. Cambridge Dictionary defines the phenomenon accordingly as follows. Hate speech is, quote, public speech that expresses hate or encourages violence toward a person or a group based on something such as race, religion, sex, and sexual orientation, and usually it's etc. So similar kinds of categories as the mentioned ones. The individuals who use and produce hate speech tend to operate recurrently and systematically. This is just an observation. On this observational basis, common sense contends that the motive states that hate speakers convey by their pejorative words and their offensive sentences are not episodic, but are long-term emotions. So the temporality is taken to be specific to the kinds of emotions that are expressed by such speech behavior. In a philosophical framing, the main problems of this common sense notion are of four kinds. First, the assumption that the speech is expressive is simply very problematic. Second, it is also assumed that the intentional states and processes that hate speech paradigmatically brings to open are merely or primarily of emotive or affective kinds and do not entail significant conative or cognitive components. So the focus, at least in the discussion, is not in the cognitive or conative components, but in the emotive ones. Thus conceived, hate speech would stem from spontaneous acts of feeling, resolving, and committing feeling, and not exhibit any other types of intentional acts, such as acts of valuing, willing, deciding, resolving, committing oneself to something. So these would be marginal to it. Third, so the third problematic assumption. By implication, common sense notion assumes that the emotion expressed in hate speech are directed outwards and not at the emotive subject themselves. So it's a kind of outward emotion that is expressed. This follows directly from the decision to conceptualize hate speech as an expression of hatred, which is a basic emotion, which does not need to include any thematic self-evaluation, unlike the so-called social emotions such as shame, guilt, or pride. Fourth, and finally, common sense discussions of hate speech operate by a broad and ambiguous concept of hatred, which seems to function as an umbrella concept, so there is not much specificity to the idea of hatred. This, of course, can be taken to be a kind of, artificial construct against which a philosopher can attack. But I think there is some truth to this common sense abstraction, at least in practical terms. These problems that I mentioned have led philosophers, but also social scientists and legal experts to develop alternative conceptualization for hate speech, such that do not rest at all on the idea of emotive ground, hatred as an emotive ground. The broad consensus among social and politically attuned philosophers today is that the phenomenon called hate speech in everyday language is not really about hatred at all, nor about any aversive or destructive emotions. They might be included in the phenomenon, they might be even centrally included in the phenomenon, but they are not necessary. They are not necessary features, essential features of the phenomenon. The idea is, rather than being expressive of emotions, hate speech is about bigotry and prejudice. The idea is, and should be defined accordingly. So from this emotive understanding to a more cognitive understanding. So there's a prejudice based in hate speech, and that might gather emotions around it, but the emotions are not necessarily defining features. This alternative manner of conceptualizing hate speech has several advantages. First, it draws attention to the fact that hate speech is typically directed at groups of people on the basis of some abstract and socially marked general feature, which we already heard, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so on. When it targets individuals, it typically targets them as members or representatives of such groups. Moreover, the features that inform hate speech are not just general or generalizing, but are idealizing and abstractive ones. They suggest that all real and possible differences between the particular individuals under attack are insignificant in light of their common hateful genus, as if. Prejudice-based accounts are able to handle these mechanisms of idealization and abstraction with tools drawn from the theory of knowledge. But it's not guided on the basic experience of hatred that we know from everyday circumstances and relations. The type of hatred at issue is drastically different from basic hatred that common sense and folk psychology know and are able to identify. Rather than being directed at experienced or cognized actions or agents, this form of hatred is directed at its own construals and thus is not provoked by anything outside its own framings, but is self-provoking. I call this type of hatred amorphous hatred, and I try to explain what I mean by it. On this basis of the analysis of hate speech, I would also like to put forward a second emotion-based argument, emotion-theoretical argument. In contrast to many contemporary contributors, I would like to contend that there is an appropriate and correct emotive response to hate speech. So there is an emotive response which is correct in respect to hate speech. This entails that emotively neutral attitudes are not sufficient to evaluate and counter this behavior. But these attitudes, be these attitudes purely cognitive or then cognitive practical. The emotion that can correctly respond to hate speech, I would like to argue, is moral disgust. So there is a specific mode of disgust which I would like to argue is the correct attitude towards hate speech. And I think I can't get to the end, but I try to at least explain to you what I would like to then do. More precisely, I will show that the emotion of disgust is necessarily needed for the correct identification of the disvalue of hate speech. So there is a specific kind of disvalue in hate speech. And disgust is a type of emotion, is a kind of emotion that can correctly identify that disvalue. The specific power of disgust in distinction from anger and indignation is first that its intentional focus is not in separate actions or action types or agents, but in manners of acting, so in a mode of acting that's at the center. And second, that disgust motivates us to study its object and not act upon it without closer inspection immediately. So it invites us not to immediately find a proper agentive attitude, but rather to stay with the object and study it in detail. However, in order to realize the moral, to get to the moral function of disgust, we would need to refresh our account of its intentionality. And for that reason, I then suggest that we turn to Aurel Kolnai's analysis of disgust. So I think that there is a resource in his analysis of disgust that can be developed into an understanding of moral disgust, which then would be an appropriate, correct reaction to hate speech. So could somebody just tell me how much time there is? I will have to ask now and then in order to keep track. Half an hour, okay. In order to say something about hate speech, I ask myself to turn to Sartre's classical essay, Anti-Semite and Jew, from 45-46. In the beginning essay, Sartre provides a short but highly illuminative account of what we today would call hate speech. To be sure, he does not use this word at all, but he gives a detailed description, and I think also an analysis of the speech behavior characteristic of anti-Semitic interventions. I venture to contend, that this account also applies to other cases of hate speech, so not only anti-Semitic speech, most importantly to racist, xenophobic, sexist, and xenophobic speech, manners of speech. In other words, I believe that the discursive tragedies that Sartre identifies in his Anti-Semite and Jew are not just employed by anti-Semitic speakers, but also by sexist, racist, homophobic, and ageist discussions. And I don't claim that they are all the same. I claim that there is a certain features that they share. What is crucial in all these cases are not just the verbal and non-verbal elements of speech behavior, but the extraordinary manner in which such elements are combined. So the combinatory character is shared by these different forms of hate speech. The main teaching of Sartre's discussion in this essay is that hate speech does not stand out by its verbal contents, nor by the opinions that it may express. The hate speaker often uses slurs and puts forward allegations and abusive and intimidating claims about his targets, but even these are not necessary parts of his discourse in Sartre's analysis, as I understand it. Many kinds of speech acts are in use. The hate speaker does not merely assert or command, but also pleads, flirts, invites, apologizes, praises, and makes promises, threats, and oaths. So a large selection of different kinds of speech acts are in use. Moreover, the prosodic features of hate speech and non-verbal expressions accompanying it are equally important as its syntactic forms or vocabularies. Rather than being distinguishable by its lexical or propositional contents or grammatical features, this speech behavior stands out by its peculiar manner of combining signifying elements of various types: verbal and non-verbal, literary and metaphorical, grammatical and prosodic. So what makes hate speech poisonous is not any of its ingredients or seasonings, but the recipe and the serving. Sartre's analysis shows that the prosodic features of speech act are equally important than offensive words and intimidating statements, opinions. These entail alterations of volume, intonation, emphasis, stress, rhythm, so kind of rhetoric features. The hate speaker draws for forgotten verbal resources from the undercurrents of propositional language and uses them skillfully, both for explicit and carefully covered purposes. He is equally capable of operating by whispers and murmurs, as by shouts and cries. He may utilize both interruptions and long monologues, but may also delay and suspend his responses, and thereby force his interlocutors to futile repetitions of questions or inquiries. Moreover, the hate speaker innovatively combines grammatical and prosodic features of language, verbal language, with non-linguistic expressions such as sighs, smears, exclamations, and giggles. And I speak about a he, it's also a she. At the same time, he may also alternate between bodily positions and movements. He may lean back to scan and inspect his interlocutors, and then suddenly stand up to draw attention. He may mumble something that only the new ones can hear, but unexpectedly switch to loud eloquence and magniloquence. Superficially considered, the hate speaker seems to operate like a child, bored with the discussions of adults and determined to end them. However, unlike a child, the hate speaker has a full repertoire of adult speech acts and concepts at his disposal. His infantile outbursts are highly disturbing and intimidating, since he is able to control them, and unlike a child, is capable of framing and garnishing them by professional jargon, technocratic and bureaucratic terms, and do so whenever that is productive to his goals. Sartre argues that this metamorphic manner of speaking serves double goals in anti-Semitic discourse, always, and this is his claim about essence, and then I would argue that the same goes for different versions of hate speech, also sexist speech. At least that's my experience. The insulting, abusive, and intimidating words, phrases, metaphors, similes, claims, slurs are targeted at the named victims, but hate speech has also another non-explicit objective in Sartre's analysis. This is the undermining of reasoned discourse itself based on facts, realities, with its commitment to evidence in both real and ideal dimensions. So that's the Sartrean kind of analysis in my understanding. The hate speaker enters the discursive field like any other participant in order to debate and negotiate about common affairs and public matters. However, when in the game, he systematically starts to challenge and defy the conventions of the discourse. And more importantly, I think, he systematically starts to challenge and defy, he also disrupts the implicit and hidden conditions on which these conventions rest. So the explicit conventions or the semi-explicit conventions, but then the underlying conditions that support those convictions are also disrupted. These lie, I think, in the basic processes of expressivity, synchronization, and turn-taking, and they are in need of empirical studies, of course. In the case of anti-Semitism, the explicit named target of hate speech is the Jew, a phantasmatically and projectively construed identity. But in the name of that construct, real Jewish people are attacked, both as a group and individually as members or representatives of the group. And this goes to all other variants, ethnic variants of hate speech. It goes to the gender variants, and it goes to variants based on language, such as in my country, that 2 languages and hate speech is built around those 2 languages. So it's not ethnicity, it's not gender, it's not sexual orientation as such, it's not language, it's not religion. It can be any of these, depending on the situation, the circumstance, and the historical process in which we are. Thus, hate speech surrounds its named targets with various disvalues and permeates them with related vices, such as animality, brutishness, greediness, and elitism. Sexist and misogynist discussions utilize terms loaded with sexual undertones or with connotations of stupidity, but also with words that are literally used for pets and farm animals or predators. So a very great mixture of different kinds of vocabularies. And racist speech is even more voluminous and more, let's say, creative. Whereas slurs, cites, and insults target the named victims, the non-verbal operations and prosodic features characteristic of hate speech paralyze all discussants equally. They are apt to overawe and silence the ones who seriously participate in exchanges about truth and reality and facts, and are committed to ask and give reasons in order to deliberate about them together. Sartre argues that under its explicit goals of silencing or marginalizing its named targets, hate speech also entails hidden goals of disrupting reasoned discourse as a whole. In a latter dimension, it operates by ridiculing discursive conventions and conditions, distorting discursive practices and intimidating discussions, and many other strategies creatively developed while going. So the secondary target is reasoned discourse on common affairs and public matters at hand, but more generally, any reasoned discourse on any matter whatsoever. As such, hate speech does not merely operate by disrupting and disorganizing the social conventional norms of discourse, of the practice of discourse, but more fundamentally also attacks the enabling or constituting rules of discourse. Despite his own estimates and verdicts, the hate speaker is therefore not comparable to the creative player who innovatively finds new ways of playing by the rules. So there is no comparison there, nor to the reformer who anticipates agreement with future discussions, nor with the artist who realizes guiding values of painting while renewing them at the same time. Rather, hate speech is parasitic on reasoned discourse. It seemingly consents to the norms of this practice, but merely for the aim of destroying the practice and replacing it by a new one, a new manner of organizing human affairs. In this respect, I believe that it joins interest and forces with the speech acts of the so-called bullshitters, as analyzed and criticized by Harry Frankfurt. So I think there is a kind of model analysis in Frankfurt on the bullshit or bullshitter that helps us understand hate speech. My point here is not to belittle the violence and harms and sufferings that hate speech inflicts on its named targets, the victims. These are considerable and they are obvious. Rather, the point is to argue that any attempt to counter hate speech and hate speakers, or to mitigate their destructive effects, can be successful only if it is based on a correct analysis of the goals and interests, or lack of interests of this form of speech. Contrary to many contemporary accounts, Sartre argues that hate speech indeed is driven by hatred, by an emotional hatred. However, he also contends that hate speech is essentially informed by many other emotions also. Thus, the verbal anacry of hate speech corresponds to a plurality of aversions, from mild bitterness and resentment, annoyance and irritation, to anger and indignation and raving rage. So the anarchy of speech corresponds with the kind of mixture of different emotions. But how, on what grounds can Sartre then contend that anti-Semitic or hate speech is mobilized, governed and guided by hatred? So on what grounds can he then claim that there is hatred at the core of this phenomenon? And again, remember, it's not only anti-Semitism that is at issue, it's a form of speech that is able to operate in respect to sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity, language, religion, and other forms of being together. I believe that we get to the core of these arguments, of Sartre's argument, by recapitulating the basic result of the classical analysis of hatred. So bringing to mind what hatred classically is, and this is Aristotle. Unlike other aversions, such as anger, indignation, hatred targets and is intentionally directed at objects that it represents as evil. So it's about what is evil in its representation. It's not interested in attacking badness, meanness, ugliness, repulsiveness, unpleasantness, but is focused on what it displays as profoundly and incurably corrupt. The crucial difference here is not merely in the intensity or levels of affectedness and affectivity. Rather, hatred intentionally posits a different type of disvalue than the other aversions. The object is framed as comprehensively and fundamentally diabolic, not just malicious in some of its features, manifestations, or activities, but its very core, it's evil. So for hate, the object is evil. The axiological content of the object corresponds to the connotative agenda of this emotion. Hatred aims at the annihilation or destruction of this evil. So there is evil, and the project is annihilation. Not necessarily killing it, but just kind of disarming it. It does not rest satisfied with revenge or retribution of the wrongs that it envisions or represents, but determinedly works for the obliteration of its evil target, the target that it represents as evil, for non-existence. Hatred, therefore, is exceptionally patient, despite its passionate force. It entails a volitional commitment, and this is Aurel Colonai's main point. It entails a volitional commitment to the feeling, and thus it is patient. It opens a perspective of long-term plans and investments. Unlike indignation, anger, and rage, it is able to wait, plan, scheme, and it never compromises itself with feelings of pity and compassion. This is Aristotle's teaching. Never compromises itself with compassion or pity. Building on Sartre and Colnay's discussions of aversions, I want to argue that there is indeed in hate speech hatred, and at the core hatred, but a very specific kind of hatred, which I would like to call, and I call, amorphous hatred. And I skip some points. The basic idea is that it's a hatred, it's directed at evil, its project is annihilation or destruction. It differs from basic emotion of hatred by its peculiar temporality. So the difference to other forms of hatred is in temporality. It extrapolates its antagonistic operation in an indeterminate future. So it opens a specific kind of future for itself with no limits. Like basic hatred, it aims at the annihilation of its object, presented as evil. But unlike basic hatred, it does not rest satisfied with the annihilation of the named target. Instead, it construes a new object for itself, a new target to be hated, and does so after each successful destruction of the prior one. Thus, the emotion continues and expands by substituting one object, one evil, by associated ones, all construed for the regulation and release of a charged bundle of indeterminate affects and ambivalent emotions that foster the subject and animate his axiological life. And I want to call it amorphous because of this specific relationship to the project of destruction, where new objects substitute the old ones when they are done, and new ones are then construed for the prolongation of the project. This variant of hatred hovers above open fields of objects like an atmosphere. It targets them opportunistically, one after another, without anchoring itself on any of their real features. To cover and compensate for this objective ambiguity of equivocation, and to justify its destructive deeds, it construes images and comprehensive imaginaries by framing realities with fantasies of evil and by colonializing human existence with animal and demonic archetypes. So how much time perhaps now? 50. The personal, interpersonal, psychic and social processes by which such amorphous hatred selects and construes its concrete objects and moves from one set of objects to the next one are highly complex. So there is a place for research, and this is very simplistic what I presented. But I think this kind of analysis about the time span holds. These processes are highly extensive in time spans, both personally and culturally. Also, the affective, instinctual, and experiential materials from which they draw vary greatly. Finally, the intersubjective dimensions of such amorphous hatreds are flexible. The emotion can be shared consciously with others, but it can be also adopted, received, or inherited from others in a non-conscious manner, like a contagious infection. Thus, its social and social-political manifestations vary greatly, from explicit movements and ideologies to vague atmospheres that nurture not only dedicated agents, but also like-minded collaborators, sympathizers, and passive onlookers. This type of hatred, I think, has been discussed, but not under this title, in earlier works. So not under this title. Scholars have studied similar and closely related emotive phenomena under different titles from the First World War onward, I think. I do not take a stand on this paper at all on the genealogy of the emotion, and that's a specific question in itself. So what is a genealogy? I do think that it's a modern phenomenon. So I don't think it's a universal human emotion. I think it has a specific historicity to it, and it comes into existence with modernity. In the second section of the paper, I want to argue that the proper moral response to hate speech as expressive of amorphous hatred is neither any value-neutral form of cognition or judgment, nor any variant of anger or indignation, such as quasi-anger or righteous indignation as suggested by some scholars. Rather, I think that the correct moral response to hate speech is a variant of disgust, and I would like to call it moral disgust because it is kind of directed at manners of human behavior. So different from what is called physiological disgust, which is directed at material things. But I think it's a form of disgust in any case. Anger is a forthright and prompt moral emotion, and therefore not patient enough to grasp the complexities of hate speech and its dynamic metamorphic force in Europe. Contempt, as proposed by some legal experts, lacks proper engagement with the phenomenon, with the object, and thus fails in getting at its core. I think disgust is specialized and able to focus and is patient enough to fathom hate speech in its whole expansion and depth. So I think we need disgust in order to properly be directed at the disvalue of hate speech. In order to see this, I think we need to revise our received account of disgust, which usually pictures this emotion either as a merely physical phenomenon or else as an emotive relic from pre-modern or pre-human manners of relating to objects. So I would think we have to refresh it, and I think Kolnai's analysis of disgust from the 20s helps us here. And the point is that he gives us a twofold analysis in which he first discusses, systematically first, physiological disgust, which is targeted at material object and phenomena, and then what he calls moral disgust, which is targeted at human behaviors, manners of acting. And the main point is that both forms of disgust share a structure. They have objects that are more isomorphic. They have similar structures, their objects. And in order to kind of suggest this, I perhaps summarize very, very fastly what I take to be Kolnai's account of physiological disgust. In that case, so in case of physiological disgust, so for example, a rotting corpse or certain types of animals or a group of certain types of animals, the percept, and it has to be a percept in Kolnai's analysis, so not a cognition, but a perceptual or imaginary relationship to the object. The percept has a particular spatial gestalt and an unstable unity. So there is a gestalt form in the object, but then this gestalt is also dynamic. So it has a temporal structure also, in which it changes in a characteristic manner. The gestalt consists of a proliferating multitude of living beings that swarm around something, a hidden something, paradigmatically a corpse. And then the proliferating multitude are some animals that eat the corpse. So the paradigmatic case is a corpse covered with flies or maggots that cover the corpse. But this has a dynamic structure in which the movement of these covering living beings first vigorously expands, but then suddenly, step by step, finds the limits of its growth and disperses and vanishes. So what happens is that this multitude of living movement exposes a nothingness, a kind of emptiness, a hollow. So there is this movement, there is the center which is covered, and there's a temporal dynamic form to the gestalt. I would like to suggest that hate speech manifests the same form. There is an extravagant growth of gestures, words, opinions expressed, and they revolve around something. And when the hate speaker steps back or moves to another discussion, then nothing is exposed. No proper opinions, no proper claims, no proper arguments, so no proper parts of discourse in which he then or she originally enters. So he comes and gives us this voluminous whole of gestural and linguistic movements, and when he is free to go, when he's ready to go, there's nothing that can be that will be exposed. On this basic idea, I would like to suggest that moral disgust, like physical disgust, is a gestalt emotion, is an emotion that is directed at the dynamic gestalt rather than any specific type of action type of agent. So my hypothesis is that moral disgust concerns not action types nor motivations of actions, but the manners in which actions are performed and put together into a whole. In order to substantiate this idea, I want to draw attention to a set of examples that Sartre offers in his analysis of disgusting human behaviors under the heading slimy in being a nothingness. In this earlier treatise, Sartre develops the so-called, what he calls psychoanalysis of things, of phenomena, and argues that individual actions and action types can be rejected as disgusting in a similar manner as disgusting materials and things can be rejected. A handshake, a smile, a deception, and a lie can be disgustingly slimy, he contends. This entails that not all actions that belong to the morally condemnable action types, such as lies or deceptions, this entails that not all of these actions that belong in such types are disgusting, are rejected as disgusting, but only some of them. And on the other hand, some actions that are quite innocent and belong to innocent action types, such as a handshake or a smile, are able to inflict its emotion. So there is a manner of relating to actions which doesn't it can be reduced to the action type or the motivations of those actions, but relates to the manner of acting. In Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva specifies the phenomenon further, I think, when she draws attention to the fact that we can also relate in disgust to types of agents, types of agency. And she gives us examples. The traitor, the liar, the criminal with good conscience, the shameless rapist, the killer who claims to be a savior. So the point is that the killer, the rapist, and the deceiver are morally reproachable because of their action type and because of their motives. But the shameless rapist is in addition morally condemnable because of the shamelessness of his act, not because of the action type, because of the manner of performing the act. In contrast to many contemporary contributors, both Sartre and Kristeva argue that disgust has important social normative functions and tasks. Moreover, Kristeva's examples give, I think, us clues about what really is at issue in such reactions, specific ways and agents who operate in particular manners. To give a concrete example, all lies are reprehensible. White lies may be tolerated with sympathy or with mixed feelings. Black lies are rejected in anger. So all these other emotions handle those types. What is disgusting is only heartless lies, such as the lies of Tom Ripley. I don't know if you know this character, Patricia, main figure, who lives by lying and enjoys the activity of lying. Correspondingly, what is disgustingly disturbing in Hannibal Lecter's case is not the mere amount of his victims or the ritualistic repetition of the crime, but Lecter's culinary, elegant and artistic attitudes towards his targets. Similarly, what is disgusting in Charles Manson's destructive actions and chaos-orientated projects is not the goals, not the motivations of destruction and chaos as such. The goals may elicit horror and fear and many other negative emotions, but not disgust. What elicits disgust is quasi-political, quasi-spiritual tone, the quasi-political and quasi-spiritual tone that Manson gives to his projects and his actions. My point here is not to belittle the quantitative dimensions of murders and genocides, but to draw attention to the fact that human sentiments, different kinds of sentiments, as well as the concept that describe them, are specific in their functions, whereas some concepts and some emotions distinguish between action types and others between motivations of actions. Still others are able to distinguish between the manners in which actions are performed, and I think disgust is one of such emotions. The Kolnain analysis suggests that the voluminous verbalizations and gesturings of hate speakers always would operate to cover something essential. If this would hold, then we would need to ask what then is covered here. The proliferating masses of swear words, slurs, smirks, sights, shouts, claims, judgments, valuations, suggestions, indications, and questions would, if he is right, and if I'm right in reading him, revolve and rotate around something, some covered, hidden center. The center cannot consist of the prejudice notions, because they are openly exposed, nor on the aversions, which also are openly expressed. Those are not hidden, they are given. Something else is covered, and not just occasionally if the analysis holds, but essentially. Moreover, when the hate speaker has completed his task in this setting, let's say, and is ready to step back or move elsewhere, nothing specific is disclosed. What is left behind is just a stunned silence or a mute, wordless suffering. On what basis could we then say that something is hidden in hate speech? I believe that Harry Frankfurt's analysis of bullshit helps answer this question. The analysis suggests that what is covered in morally problematic cases of proliferating verbalization is a lack of discursive seriousness. And this sounds like kind of nothing, but I think he's right in his analysis in suggesting that actually it is a key to understanding what is happening today. On this account, the hate speaker, like the bullshitter, enters reasoned discourse on public affairs like any other participant. However, his voiced commitments and assurances hide a fundamental shallowness and emptiness in respect to such discourse. What is lacking, in simple words, in hate speech is seriousness in respect to evidence. That is, serious concern and care for the requirements and conditions of evidencing. And I have a small quote actually from Frankfurt to show you that where he's pointing at. He argues the bullshitter in his own bullshit may not deceive us or even intend to do so, either about the facts or about what he takes the facts to be. What he does necessarily attempt to deceive us about is his own enterprise. The only indispensably distinguishable characteristic of his speech is that in a certain way he misrepresents what he is up to. This is the crux of the distinction between him and the liar. Both he and the liar represent themselves falsely as endeavoring to communicate truth. The success of each depends upon deceiving us about that, so that's not the distinction between them, the two. The fact about himself that the liar hides is that he is attempting to lead us away from a correct apprehension of reality. So he cares about reality. His main attempt is based on the distinction between reality and falseness. He tries to lead us away from reality. The bullshitter, in contrast, tries to hide something else. He doesn't try to hide reality. And Frankfurt continues. The fact about himself that the bullshitter hides, on the other hand, and in contrast, is that the truth values of his statements are of no concern, no central interest to him. What we are not to understand or notice in his action is that his intention is neither to report the truth nor to conceal it. So the distinction does not matter at all for him, and that is hidden. The indifference in non-interest in the distinction. And he argues further. For the bullshitter, all bets in the truth game are off. He's neither on the side of the true nor on the side of the false. He does not care whether the things he says describe reality correctly or not. He just picks them out or makes them up to suit his purpose on. So the difference between the liar and the bullshitter, and I think also between the liar and the hate speaker, is that the liar is very interested in the distinction between truth and falseness, reality and fantasy. But the bullshitter or the hate speaker is not at all interested in. He can use it if it serves his interests and his purposes, but he has no investment in that distinction in his own enterprise. So that's the main point, and I think this helps us understand what happens in hate speech. On the basis of Frankfurt's analysis on bullshit, I would like to argue that hate speech disregards this investment in two manners, and the first one is bad, but the second one is worse. The first one is this: discursive seriousness is lacking from the speech acts of the hate speaker himself. in a similar manner as it is lacking from the verbalization of the bullshitter. The speaker enters the game of reasoned discourse, but immediately begins to undermine his undermining activities. But discursive seriousness also is under attack in another way. We are invited and provoked to answer in anger, in indignation, in rage, in fear, in panic, in the worst case. So we are invited to postpone our discursive answers to him and then put them aside or suspend them for the moment and respond in similar measures. So we are invited to make an exception from the game in the same manner as he systematically makes his exceptions. And that latter is, I think, more dangerous. So he himself lacks seriousness, but he provokes us to make an exception in our own seriousness, to suspend our seriousness for a moment, because his acts are so provocative that we have to answer in anger, in indignation, in rage, and I think in a worst case, in panic. And I think disgust comes as a help, and it has two virtues. It allows us to stay in exchange with the hate speaker. It just kind of says, take a small distance, keep your eyes in the object, observe it, let it be, don't react to it, just keep this distance. It has a patience. It's able to stay with the object, so the hate speak and the hate speaker. So the caution built-in disgust, the patient built-in disgust keeps us at distance from the provocations of the hate speakers, so that we are not infected by them, because we take distance, but we stay in a suitable distance, but in the exchange. We are not agitated in our own responses to answer by the same measures and thereby escalate the destruction of the practices of discursive discourse, reasoned discourse. Not even for a moment, not even for this moment that is demanding, because his actions are so provoking. So perhaps I end here and leave the rest for the discussion.
And now, a little happy ending for this very dark evening. Yes. So you see that here is an object, and this was the original idea of a former president of the society, Lambert Wiesing, and I was the first person who was absolutely delighted receiving this object, because for the Husserl Lecture, it is one of Husserl's favorite objects, an ashtray. So for those who don't know, Husserl really was a heavy smoker. He landed in hospital twice because of a nicotine poisoning. And this is not what we want you to do. So this is not. So the idea is not to get our prize winners smoking. But, and if I may hand you this. So this is from the artist Silke. Yes, exactly. And it's from the artist Silke Rehberg. And her approach to this was that she actually, it's a bit of a cubist approach, that Husserl is looking at the ashtray from different adumbrations, So it's not simply an ashtray as an object, but an ashtray as a perceptual object, of course. And we also have a quote for this here, which is on every award here, which is from Husserliana 38, page 202. And here Edmund Husserl says, "Ich sehe den Aschenbecher." And then he starts an analysis like he often does. So, Sara, here is the Husserl Lecture Award.
Yeah, in Finland we have cigarettes made of liquids. Oh. So I can use them, but also the pens. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and really honored. Thank you. And I will have very envious colleagues in Helsinki.
So now let's have a reception. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Right.